Hi, Miss Pine again. You just clicked on the Help and Hinder link. I'm going to talk to you about how GMLL helps and hinders learning. Um, so when we think about how it helps, we can speak with our hands without using our lips. We can speak without talking. We can comprehend without hearing. We can reiterate and we can emphasize messages. We can reduce our cognitive load, which basically means when you are, say, for example, if you are doing, as a child, you are doing head, shoulders, knees, and toes as an English learner, and you are beginning phase of EL. You are trying to figure out basic nouns, head, shoulders, knees, and toes. So by doing the mimicking the movements and pointing to your head, your shoulders, your knees, and your toes, you're able to reduce your cognitive load. You're able to associate movement and song with words and nouns that you should know. So that's able to put less strain on your brain, and it allows memorization to be easier. So the brain's activity can be modified by the body's action. So in one of my studies that I listed in my references, there was a study done for the brain, and it showed an MRI scan about how many different areas were affected with gestures. And it showed that the brain actually the activity can modify by the body's actions. So it engages the motor systems, it can improve recall, and there are several parts of the brain that are enacted by a certain word. So it talked about in that article in particular, it talked about the word onion. It talked about how it engages all of the senses in the brain. It talks about how you can smell the onion. When you think about the word onion, the way the things are memorized, it brings out a bunch of emotions, it brings out a bunch of senses. So you're able to remember that a brain or an onion smells the way it smells, it feels the way it feels. You can even taste it before you would taste it, like by cutting the onion. And it talks about associating it with different memories. So if you have a negative association with onion, if you hate onions, or you remember, your mom cutting them fondly in the kitchen, there's certain emotions that are associated with certain words that can help in that. So watching gestures process what you're doing, and then they can also, if you're watching them, they can try to anticipate what you're doing next. So say if I was a teacher and my students were watching me, they would be watching my gestures, and not only would they be comprehending my gestures, they would be anticipating what I would do next. So that helps skills such as prediction. It helps them anticipate certain things, which is just a whole different area of the brain. So when we think about helps, we also have to think about hindrances. So the first thing that I want to think about is kind of a help and a hindrance. So one example is using sign language or using gestures with deaf and mute students. So in the article that I'm referencing, they talked about how it's its own linguistic system, ASL. So it doesn't even really count as part of the gestures. But for example, the use of these is very, very helpful for students who are deaf, for students who are mute, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it also can be hindered because there's too much dependence on it. So say, for example, being mute. I have a student that I actually have just met very briefly that I'm going to have next year. And they have a learning disability. They are selective mute. They have a little bit of trauma in their past, which I assume attributes to their selective mute and their ESL. So it's going to be a challenge on many fronts, but one challenge I have for myself is to help with using ASL or help with using gestures, but not allowing that student to become so dependent on my gestures or their gestures that their verbal skills do not develop. So that's very important to make sure you are making those two distinct, that it's helping it, it's not hindering it by too much dependency on it. Some other hindrances can be misunderstandings. We talked about that with a lot of different gestures, meaning a lot of different things in countries. So especially if students are coming in, whether you're the English teacher and your students coming from that country that might be affected or offended by certain gestures, you may look like a fool when you are doing the okay sign, or they may learn English and then move to a different country and be dependent on those gestures, thinking those gestures are fine. And there's misunderstandings that could happen. There was a study that I quoted in my references that talked about how planned ignoring is a result of too many gestures. So they talked about how using like numerical numbers, they use in math lessons, they talked about how they would use 2 and 3 when they would say the number. They found that actually some of the gestures were distracting and they could be kind of redundant and not helpful to the lesson itself. So that was a negative. If they're too extravagant and too distracting, they can also not help. They may hinder. And then finally, if you pick up the incorrect gesture, it could be a bad habit to break. So just thinking about how everyone runs into a not great teacher in their learning experience in your 12 years of kindergarten through high school, think about maybe a not so great teacher that you had that may have taught you something that you don't appreciate or may not have taught you very well at all. So with all these gestures and different teachers using them, there could be a miscommunication. There could be a teacher that teaches you a wrong gesture or a teacher that teaches you something different. And then you carry it with you, especially if you learn it at such a young age. So that's important to remember as well.